Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
I'm Mike Murphy. I'm co-director of the USC Dornsight Center for the Political Future, and I get to be the moderator here because I'm also a foreign policy nerd. A million years ago, I was a Russian area studies major at Georgetown. Though I've lost all the Russian, I've kept the interest, and I am so excited to be on a panel with two true experts. We have former Congresswoman Jane Harman, who's our presidential scholar in residence at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC. She's also a USC mom, so she's like a four-star general now in our USC hierarchy. She had a distinguished career in Congress, serving 9 terms from California, first being elected in 1992. She was on all the major security committees in the House, including Armed Services, Intelligence, and Homeland Security, ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee after 9/11, when the stakes started rising. And she was a regular participant in the classified Gang of Eight briefings that only the top congressional intelligence people get to know what's really going on. Also joining us, you Curbed Your Enthusiasm fans may know him, but so does every national security thinker in the country, a true patriot, Lieutenant Colonel, though I'm going to call him Colonel because he was about to be promoted Colonel, and then the Trump people got an oily tentacle going and did a disservice, but he's decorated, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, and he's had all the key jobs in this sector. He was most recently the director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the White House National Security Council. Previously, he was the political military affairs officer for Russia, for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he was attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He knows the territory. He's currently a doctoral study. He's got a Harvard master's and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins. So let's start the discussion, and I will remind you, as Katie did, that you can go to the chat room and leave your comments, and I'll try to get to some of them. No guarantee I'll get to them all, but please leave it there, and we'll get to those a little later. Colonel Vindman, I'll start with you. Give us a situation report. Where are we today on the ground in Ukraine? And then we'll work to the wider political issues from there.
First, let me thank you, Mike, and Congressman Harman and the Price School for putting this on and giving me an opportunity to talk about these very important issues. We're actually on the cusp of phase 2, plan C or D of this war for the Russians. Plan A was a deeply miscalculated, misconceived idea of quick lightning strike into Ukraine, surrounding the major cities, toppling the Ukrainian government, and a rapid withdrawal after seating a puppet regime. That turned out to be a unmitigated military disaster, deeply flawed on the premise of who the Ukrainian people were, their desire for freedom, democracy, independence, built on 30 years of freedom after the post-Soviet, after the end of the Soviet Union, and a misplaced notion of sovereignty, the power of large states versus medium states, and so forth. So after a significant military defeat, and I would say the Department of Defense doesn't necessarily have the best grasp on this. I kind of couch it as they're about 2 to 3 weeks behind on their battle damage assessment, their casualty figures, and so forth. But they're starting to close the gap. I think large portions of the Russian military have been destroyed. That's a technical term that means once you fall, below about 70% combat power, that it's a unit that's no longer combat effective. So those units that were fighting in the north around Ukraine, around the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, around Chernihiv, around Kharkiv, have taken significant losses. And now the casualty rates are approaching somewhere in the ballpark of 18,000, according to what the Ukrainians are reporting. And I think those are frankly a lot closer to reality than the 10,000 or less that were reported even a week or two ago. And the numbers of vehicles destroyed, my best guess, over scouring the internet, the Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels, all the open source intelligence, is that the Russians have taken a pounding in some of these regions, and again have fallen to about 70% combat power, just devastating losses, hundreds and hundreds of tanks and hundreds of, at this point, thousands of vehicles in total. And they're shifting to something that I guess I offered as it. I'm glad they didn't take my advice many weeks ago. But about after the first week or so, it was clear to me that having this multi-pronged attack to the north, a couple of prongs to the north, actually to the east and to the south, was just a poorly conceived idea. It was decentralized. They didn't have command and control. You need to have kind of a hierarchy, belly button for these operations. They didn't have that. And the wise thing for them to do would be to withdraw, secure their lines of communication, and conduct a deliberate attack with lines, these kind of supply lines intact and not vulnerable to these punishing raids by the Ukrainians that have been masterful in the execution of this task. So now this is what happened. The Russians withdrew. Their north of Kiev is now completely under Ukrainian control. Another region called Suma to the east is also entirely under Ukrainian control. There are some battles going on around Kharkiv. It's unlikely that the Russians are going to give up that territory because they need it as one of their prongs for a kind of what they think is going to be a way to isolate the troops in eastern Ukraine. And they're going to continue their operations in the south. So they're going to take what they have now, all this force, reconstitute units. That's going to take weeks, replenish them with personnel, make sure they have functional weaponry, and try to do a limited operation. My view is timed for May 9th, timed for a Victory Day parade where the Russians can claim some victories. So that's really, about 5 weeks from now. And some of those victories include seizing Mariupol, some of the medium-sized cities in the Donetsk region. And then from there, that a misconception is that that's not how this ends. That's not how this is. We get to negotiations or negotiated solution. We actually just complete phase one for the Russians if they're successful there, which is not a given. But if they're successful there, then they press on to some of their other objectives. That includes Kharkiv, that includes Odessa, and all these types of things. It's a recipe for protracted war. And that's what concerns me, is that, if there are some policymakers that think that we don't want to arm Ukraine too much because then if they win too decisively, it destabilizes Russia. We just need to let them win enough. That's a recipe for disaster, because any success on the part of Russia in the next 4 to 5 weeks is going to be a recipe for protracted war. That's kind of the picture going into what I would call a summer campaign. And that's where we stand. That's where we need to start thinking about, how do we get Ukraine to be successful in this next phase?
Congresswoman Harman, your take on where we stand, and maybe some observations about the UN did some talking today, but I think many people are wondering, now that we have atrocities piling up of a horrific nature, shouldn't they be doing more?
Well, let me give some context, because I thought what Alex Vindman just said is everything I could possibly imagine, and some things I didn't know about the on-the-ground military situation, so I don't even want to touch that. It's impressive what he knows, and it's impressive the roles he has played, including the conclusion of his service to the Trump administration and the way he handled that, and then the conclusion of his service in the military. So I'm a huge fan. I'm proud of my new title as the USC Presidential Scholar in Residence. I'm not actually in residence. In fact, I'm not even in LA today, but I am a resident of LA. And my son, one of my 4 kids, Dan Harman, who graduated in 2006, has gone on to a very successful career because he's extremely well educated and tended the. So on this subject, I was in Congress in 1994 when an agreement was struck among Ukraine, Russia, the US, and the UK, and vouched for by the UN, which resulted in Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of its sovereignty. I mentioned Russia. Russia was one of the signatories to this. So segue to now, Russia violated this agreement. And oh, by the way, what message does this send to countries like North Korea and Iran, who have nuclear capacity and wonder whether they should ever surrender, give up, modify their own nuclear arsenals, or in Iran's case, they're about to be nuclear capacity, in exchange for guarantees. Just let's park that. I was then in Ukraine in 2014 on the Maidan, which is the central square in Kyiv, looking at the memorials to the people who were able, young people, not a huge number, to push out the Russian puppet who then headed Ukraine. His name is Yanukovych. Remember that name because he might be back somehow if Russia is successful. Let's hope not. But at any rate, there were the memorials to the people who died on the Maidan. And what came after that was a free and fair election. I was an observer. I was on a delegation headed by the late, great Madeleine Albright. And we observed that Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, who was defeated in a free and fair election by Volodymyr Zelensky, was elected fairly. And he was. And he served 5 years. So nobody thought, I don't think anybody thought we would be here with this today. I didn't even think that 6 weeks ago when I was in the audience at the Munich Security Conference in Munich, something I've gone to regularly. There was a huge number of members of Congress. Zelensky was there in person. And again, bravely left his country. People worried that there might be a coup while he was gone for the few hours. But he said to the delegates, I had breakfast at home and I will be back for dinner. I mean, what an amazingly brave leader. And I guess he was back for dinner. But then came what we're witnessing now. So some people predicted it. I'm guessing that Alex Vindman predicted it. I really thought Putin wouldn't do this. So wrong. And finally, I was in Doha, Qatar, in the Middle East just a week ago. Zelensky was beamed in with lots of leaders from the Middle East and some Americans as well. When I also saw a broader context, which I know we're going to get to, which is that countries outside of, and I think it's important to stress this, outside of the US and Europe are hedging their bets. A lot of countries in the Middle East, a lot of countries in Africa, India, countries in Latin America, and they're not picking a team here. They're not. They're condemning the violence, but they're not signing up for full-blown sanctions against Russia. In fact, some of them are trading with Russia, and some of them have trading arrangements with China too. So it's just a point to worry about. But you asked about the UN, and what happened at the UN today is not much. Zelensky gave an impassioned speech to the Security Council, and he said, what kind of security do you guarantee if you're not guaranteeing the security of my country when you agreed to do that? And he also suggested that Russia be expelled or at least prevented from vetoing actions of the Security Council, and that the organization of the UN be reconsidered so that it becomes a more important institution. What has the UN done so far? Well, the Security Council considered a resolution condemning Russia. It was vetoed by Russia. Surprise. Then the General Assembly considered a resolution condemning Russia. It passed, but there were 35 abstentions, including many of the countries I've just identified, and 5 no votes, obviously, including Russia. So the UN hasn't done much. And something I think we should talk about is whether the UN could field, there's history for this in the Korean War, peacekeepers, including possibly some US members of the peacekeeping force, to police a humanitarian zone, because what we've been seeing on the news is these brave Ukrainian civilians trying to leave the most impacted neighborhoods and being ambushed again, despite promises by the Russians.
Thank you. So, watching this, and you guys can correct me here. I'd love to hear both your views. I'll start with Colonel Vindman, but watching it seems there are 2 big forces in the last 4 or 5 days that are colliding and pushing in different ways. On one side, the Ukrainians have done a terrific job tactically on the military battlefield. So Putin, a strong man who's needs that perception of strength, is losing and more cornered. which makes him, as you said, kind of more desperate to find a victory to try to shore up his situation with. Simultaneously, the horrific massacres and mass graves we're finding in Bucha, and I'm sure more places, is also a countervailing pressure I think makes it tough for the Indias and the Chinas to be where they were a week ago. Maybe they're cynical enough, but I think Putin is he's moving into North Korea territory here with these actions. So on one hand, he needs a win more than ever. Militarily, it's going badly, never good for a strong man. On the other hand, he's getting the idea of negotiating some out for him is becoming harder because he's becoming such a villain and so isolated, even where maybe the PRC and others that have a strategic interest in kind of making trouble here may cool a little. Thoughts about that? Am I wrong? What do you think the Chinese will do going forward? And then the fork for American policymakers. Do we admit that escalation isn't always bad in a slow, controlled way to try to break them? Or is it peace at any price for the new Republic of the Donbass or whatever they think a solution could be? And Colonel, you kind of hinted that you thought that was a false herring. It was just a regroup and reattack strategy on the Russian side. But there's a lot of foreign policy CW about that now. Just let them have a corner to get them out of it. I think you think that's the wrong thing, but I love your thoughts on both China and the allies. And what do you think the next realistic moves for Putin are under each scenario?
So let me start with why this makes sense for Putin as a protracted war, because in a war of attrition, a prolonged war, Russia, a country of 140 million, with massive depots, almost endless depots of equipment, is the favorite. It just kind of grind down over the course of a masterful campaign by Ukraine. They've still lost artillery. They've still lost, a part of their military, their air power, and so forth. And that's just a recipe for kind of a slow loss for Ukraine, a slow victory for Russia. And based on the costs that Russia's already borne, and Putin's own desires and lack of respect for Ukraine's sovereignty or desire to punish Ukraine for resisting his overtures or demands, that's the mentality that Putin views Ukraine with. With regards to this question, fundamentally, it's a question about off-ramps. What is the way out of this? I kind of would reframe that in a slightly different direction. Putin, as a strongman, has the recourse, and with tight controls over propaganda, has the recourse to, frankly, quite easily pivot and declare victory, having destroyed numerous cities, and claim that he's successfully demilitarized and denazified Ukraine. He's not there yet, and that's because he still thinks he has the military might to do that. So the recipe is not to grant him a small win, because that's a recipe for protracted war, but instead it is to grant him a decisive military defeat in which he no longer has the military means to achieve his military and political objectives. That's the recipe for him to then, as a strongman, even without a tangible gain, still claim. He has some tangible gains. He could freeze the situation where he controls more of Ukraine's territory. He's got water supplies to Crimea. He's got a land bridge to Crimea. He's got some tangible things he could claim, and then just again throw a parade for his people, say that he went home. He's gone home. The other aspect of this is right now he doesn't have any wins, and that allows fence sitters, he doesn't have decisive losses. So that allows fence sitters to kind of sit on the fence and see which way the winds blow over the course of the next 4 to 6 weeks, and come in either with direct support to Putin or condemnation, because nobody wants to be on the side of the loser. And the most dangerous of these is, frankly, China. China was promised a short war. China was promised probably a 2-day campaign, away with little to no consequences, a fait accompli scenario, and then kind of some sort of deal behind the scenes where where China would ease the blow of some of the sanctions. But again, light sanctions. That was the expectation from the beginning. That's almost certainly what China's been promised. That didn't materialize, and China's sitting out on the sidelines. But if Russia does achieve some gains, China will return to its natural state, which is supporting Putin, supporting the kind of authoritarian alternative to Western liberal democracy. And we can see China come in and that could be decisive, because that would be just a broader proxy war between East and West. And that could be just a recipe for disaster, not for Ukraine, which would be wrecked, but also probably for a spillover into the broader world. On the UN thing, I think it's worth noting that the whole purpose of the UN was, frankly, to stop major war. I mean, nobody had a particularly wishful thinking about war in general. It's kind of a feature of a human existence. And the UN didn't do enough to stop a lot of wars. But the theory was that it was supposed to prevent major war. We now have a major war between the largest country in the world and the largest country in Europe. And if the UN is not effective, in somehow addressing this war adequately, or God forbid, this war which has already spilled over in economic spheres, which has already spilled over kind of an information warfare, we're probably on the cusp of cyber warfare. If it spills over into military warfare, Cold War to hot war, and the UN fails to do anything about that, then it frankly becomes the end of the UN. Also, it's no longer kind of justifies the expenditures, its existence. So I think there's a kind of a self-preservation theme here that the UN has to do more. They might not realize it yet, but that's the way I kind of see it.
Congresswoman Harman, your take?
Well, let me weigh in on that last comment about the UN. I mean, most people, until this war, this invasion, really, thought that NATO was kind of outmoded and the EU was having internal fights. And guess what? They are reinvigorated by this war. So maybe a hope, at least it would be my hope, is that this could help reinvigorate the UN, which is moribund, which is all process and no outcomes in most cases. And the structure of the Security Council, as Zelensky pointed out this morning, is that the aggressor who happens to be in the Security Council can block it from doing anything. Right. And that's absurd. So I remember Madeleine Albright worked on some issues like this. And boy, we need her back. We need the UN right now, I would say, is at the lowest ebb of its existence. And I think we're in total agreement on that. On the rest of it, there are a few more things to put on the table. One piece of goodish news, maybe, and one piece of baddish news. The goodish news is that tomorrow, President Biden says he's going to have another round of sanctions. And I think that we may get even closer to cutting Russia off from the SWIFT international banking system in all respects, not just in some respects, which will hobble enormously its ability to function. I also think that Europe, which is going to be very hard hit by this, but which is recognizing not just through this depraved conduct on the part of Russia, but also its proximity to Ukraine and this flood of refugees coming into Europe, that it has a lot at stake, that Europe will tighten its belt and try some austerity measures to wean itself from purchases of oil and gas from Russia. This is a major lifeline for Putin. It's almost the only thing he has left. He's getting billions of dollars, let's understand this, from European countries who are dependent on Russian oil and gas. And so you could ask, well, where are the other sources of oil and gas? We have some, and we're opening our strategic petroleum reserve first to bring down the cost of gas to U.S. consumers. I haven't heard that we're going to ship any of it abroad. I think that might be something to seriously contemplate. But there's also the Middle East, which I was just, as I said, in Qatar, which is the largest producer of natural gas. Qatar says its supplies are fully committed. And even if it had more supplies, it couldn't really send them to Europe because the only places that have infrastructure to receive gas are Poland, good for Poland, and Spain. And there's nothing in the middle. And Germany, which shut off its civil nuclear power some years ago, is totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. So, I'm just saying, if Europe could step up here, it could inflict a big blow. The other part, I said that was the goodish news. The baddish news is May 9 may not be the deadline, although I understand why it has a certain ring to it in terms of Russian Independence Day. Some people are suggesting that 2024 is the end date because guess what? If Joe Biden is no longer president, and if possibly Donald Trump or a Trump-like character is president of the U.S., those folks, I think we've recently seen the movie, have much more affection for Russia than they do for Ukraine. So I think maybe Putin, it has been speculated, I don't have any idea if this is true, can keep this frozen conflict going for a while. He might think that in geopolitical terms, he'll end up in a better place.
And it's an interesting strategy, saved by the orange bell, if he can hold out. So I think you make a great point. People forget that, Russia tried to conquer the Ukraine with the GDP of Italy, and they're heading for Bulgaria. And if we could curb the oil weapon, it would be incredibly powerful. There's just the logistical problem of how do you build terminals quickly. But I totally agree, game changer. Colonel, I think to summarize a point you made that I agree with, nothing wins like winning for the Ukrainians, rather than that war of attrition, which is the Russian game. So if you were back in the White House advising a more rational president, how do we get to the Ukrainians winning enough to preempt the attrition war, the long grind, the wait to 2024 on the Putin side? There's been a lot of debate over how much arms. We've definitely shipped in a lot of things, but not the high altitude air defense and stuff like that could help. What do you think the White House policy and the NATO policy should be? How do the Ukrainians accomplish that? What do they need to do it? And what's the Western role?
Yeah. So first, we need to kind of change our mindset, our policy mindset about what this confrontation is and what this confrontation isn't. This confrontation currently is a struggle between two systems, the struggle between, an understanding of countries and their right to self-determination, and the kind of a more fundamental, antiquated view of rules of the jungle, might makes right. So it's non-negotiable. We do need to win this one, and it's the Ukrainians that are, in a lot of ways, saved our bacon, because we could have easily ended up in a scenario where Russia was successful. I mean, just counterfactual, it was successful, and then this would inspire more territorial grabs by Russia, kind of irredentist project to reestablish the empire, and it would have inspired more of this kind of behavior from China with regards to Taiwan, Iran, and so forth, with states on its periphery. So this is not one that we could afford to lose. The other thing we need to reframe is we bought into kind of Russia's propaganda to a certain extent. We bought into Russia's exceptionalism, and that part of that was based on this notion that Russia has nuclear weapons, and therefore it can do anything and everything. It could subject us to nuclear blackmail, and we have no choice but to kind of, to just swallow that. That is a false premise. I mean, the bar for nuclear war is extremely high because of mutually assured destruction. It's an almost impossible threshold. So the prospects for a broader nuclear war are there. We should be mindful and plan for them, but they're not something that easily unfolds. I think, frankly, if anything, to me, the hazards are protracted war, more irresponsible, deeply irresponsible behavior. That's kind of like a kind way of saying it from Putin, his poking and prodding, seeking out vulnerabilities, using pressure, and crossing a red line that does compel the direct action from the U.S. We see some of those happen. Some of those telegraphed with regards to attacks on nuclear power plants. If there was a major nuclear accident, it would have forced U.S. hands to establish no-fly zones, secure some of these facilities. These atrocities speak to our population and our respect for human life, something that doesn't exist in Russia. that's going to be something that ultimately presses us to be more involved. The population's already there, frankly. It's our political elites that, frankly, are a little bit behind because they overthink it. They think about like nuclear escalation. The other thing is, taking a step down to conventional war, providing Ukraine military weapons does not trigger a broader conventional war. Russia is already bogged down in this struggle. There is zero utility in Russia expanding this war in a bigger way that makes it much more complicated for Russia to achieve any aims whatsoever. So therefore, we've kind of knocked back the scenario of nuclear war. We kind of knocked back the scenario of broader conventional war. So what are the risks? The risks are frankly a much more manageable scenario in which Russia loses because they conceived this poor war, they're conducting this poor war, and there's some potential instability, and we have some deep fears now against what happens. What's the follow-on to Putin? Is it somebody worse? Traditional issues that unfolded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. What should we be doing? The prescription is relatively straightforward. I wrote an article about this for Foreign Affairs. We should be establishing depots in Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary if we can get away with it, and just warehousing everything that they possibly could need. So it's in time logistics, it's in time military material, not these things that flow in after the Ukrainians kind of make a request, and then there's transit times. There's all sorts of deficiencies. And we should be doing this with Soviet era equipment, Warsaw Pact equipment. So these are the high altitude and medium altitude air defense systems. This is the MiG-29s and the Su-25s. These are the kind of air to air fighters, air to ground fighters. This would be the tanks from that era that the Ukrainians could jump in immediately. They could be using all this stuff. And then the replenishment of artillery that they've been losing, but has been also one of the key capabilities. This is how they punish the Russian military in a lot of ways. And lastly, we should prepare for a protracted war, which means that we throw away this excuse of it takes a long time to train the Ukrainians on our equipment, and we start training the Ukrainians on our equipment with the expectation that this could be something that goes for months. And that's when we start opening up the aperture to US-made equipment or European NATO equipment. We should be doing that now. We should have done it weeks ago, but we should be doing that now.
Jane, what do you think about that? What are concrete steps to take if the theory is the more the Ukrainians win, the better our hand, rather than settling into pure attrition?
I agree with that. I was at a dinner in Washington last night. Washington's an amazing place, except when it isn't. But Oksana Markarova, who is the really impressive Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., was there. And she was asked, what do you really need? And she said, we need to win. That was exactly the point. And we need you to think that we can win. And we don't know that you thought that 6 weeks ago, but we hope by now you think it is possible. And obviously that's nice to say, but to get it done, you do need to pre-position supplies, and you do need to train, and you do need to provide humanitarian aid, and you do need, I think, to consider UN peacekeepers. If the no-fly zone is anathema to many in Europe, UN peacekeepers shouldn't be. It should not be. So we need to do all that. The one thing I would disagree with is on the use of weapons of mass destruction. Maybe not nukes, but let's remember that one of the drivers here is that chemical weapons were used in Syria by Bashar Assad against his citizens, violating a red line that President Obama set. What did we do? Nothing, except to call in Russia to end up taking some of those chemical supplies away. I wonder if they're the ones that it now has in stored and could use. And it also gave Russia a beachhead into the Middle East, which has been exploiting ever since. But I think that the fact that we failed to act there empowered Putin to think, and we failed to act on Crimea, empowered Putin to think he could get away with this. And I also worry a lot about the use of chemical weapons because there's a history of Russia doing that.
Right, exactly. Let me do a devil's advocate question. So the supplies surge, more powerful supplies. We begin training Ukrainians on strong Western weapons that could be into the flow in 90 days or whatever in a longer war. Things get worse for the Russians. The economic sanctions continue to grip. Some hardcore advisor walks into Putin's office and said, look, it's time to use a small tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine to reverse the battlefield and scare the holy hell out of the Europeans and the Americans, who immediately freak out. They will never escalate, and they will demand peace talks, and we get a deal from a stronger position. Our military doctrine, is a little different than the U.S. on small battlefield nukes. Why not cross that line, scare the hell out of them, and try to get a better deal? What is our response? Do we go? I mean, a lot of thorny questions there. And, we have a foreign policy that is linked to public opinion. And the nuclear genie is terrifying to the electorates that choose the politicians in Europe and the U.S. And the Russians are hard-hearted and calculated. And if they're in a corner, is that a possible scenario? And what do we do about it? Colonel, I'll start with you, and then.
Yeah. So I think it's that's a good framing of the potential use of nuclear weapons. It's not going to be with regards to a threat against another nuclear power,
right? Because
of the implications of mutually assured destruction. And part of my contention is that the longer this war goes, the more likely that Congresswoman Harman's point is sound, that Russia is going to be backed into a corner and then use chemical weapons to first kind of achieve the battlefield effects that they want, but also to test the resolve of the West. Is this precipitate kind of U.S. involvement or not? So I think the longer this goes on, the more likely it is. I mean, in a sharp Ukrainian victory, it's less likely that they're going to do that, because right now they still think that, especially in the first 6 weeks of the war, they thought that they could achieve some of their military objectives. That seems increasingly unlikely. And I think the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it gets, the more Putin feels cornered and has to resort to something that in his mind is not unprecedented. This is used in Syria. And there were plenty of industrial chemical weapons used, but there's also evidence that actual chemical weapons themselves, manufactured chemical weapons, were used there also. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's an unlikely scenario. And the Russians have, to a certain extent, prepared the battlefield, prepared the informational battlefield, saying that it's going to be the Ukrainians that do this. With regards to the nuclear question, again, I think the longer this goes, the more Putin resorts to his standard grab bag of increased pressure. If we kind of review our history of how we got here, it wasn't all of a sudden Putin waged war, a major war against Ukraine. It's the fact that in 2002, earlier than that, in 2000, he started a war against Chechnya and wiped Grozny off the map. Then he went after oligarchs. Then he tried to orchestrate his preferred candidate, Yanukovych, in precipitating the Orange Revolution. Then he asserted a privileged sphere of influence. Then he started a war with Georgia. Then he started. Then he had the first opening phase of this war in 2014, Syria, assassinations, chemical agents, and nuclear agents, bounties on U.S. soldiers, interference in U.S. elections. He felt that he was successful in a lot of these. He felt like the U.S. backed off. This is the kind of person that we're facing. The longer he thinks he's still in this, the more likely he's likely to go to his standard grab bag of pressure. And in this case, I think he frankly, there's a mismatch between reality and expectations. He expects he'll get away with it. I don't think President Biden would let him get away with it. I don't think Europeans would let him get away with it. And that's a recipe for disaster. On the nuclear use in Ukraine, look, the Ukrainians are not prepared to take a loss. They're going to fight this. They're going to fight. If they had to throw a fight this with sticks and stones, they would do that. They're not going to give up their sovereignty. So it's going to be a protracted war no matter what. And it's going to be a protracted war that Ukraine could still win, even under kind of the worst case scenarios, just because of their resolve, their military prowess. And they understand that Russia has been kind of saber-rattling nuclear weapons employment. They want weapons. They want to win this. They want to preserve their country and territorial integrity. We could either be parochial and say, we know better, like we've done so many times, and say, we know better, we'll tell you what you need, or we could actually give them the tools that they need to win. And they understand the risks. They understand the adversary better than we do. They've lived with Vladimir Putin on their border, waging war against them for 8 years. I think we should probably just not be as paternalistic and parochial in our views towards this really world leader now. It's emerged as a world leader with a very, very competent leadership. And we shouldn't succumb to fears. We shouldn't self-deter.
Congresswoman?
I would just add a few things. I mean, it's interesting. We're coming at this from different vantage points. One, an accomplished soldier and White House policy advisor, and the other, a 100-year-old former member of Congress, beaten down by the partisan toxic wars. But
as also an expert on national security on all the committees in the classified briefing team of 8. Yes.
Yes, don't forget that. But I kind of buy that, but I worry about a couple of things. I agree, we should not be paternalistic. And by the way, I've been in, again, some conversations of members of the Senate just recently, bipartisan, where they are prepared to back increased amounts of U.S. military aid, which has been requested by the president. And, a few people disagree, like Rand Paul, who's a libertarian. But most people agree that this is a good thing on a bipartisan basis. Just imagine that there's something that Congress agrees on. So there's that. But Bashar Assad got away with using chemical weapons. He got away with it. And now there's a conversation about whether he should be welcomed back into the community of nations. There's an argument that Biden should forgive Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia for the grotesque behavior that his country did. He still denies he had anything to do with it. Involving the journalist Khashoggi, who had a U.S. green card. And so, if you survive long enough, at least a lesson that Putin may be learning or believing is that you get away with stuff. We agree, obviously, on the use of chemical weapons. On the use of some kind of tactical nukes, I think the risk is immediately that you can't control, at least I don't think you can, the pollution that comes from that to a specific area. And if it wafts over into Poland, let's imagine, or there's an electromagnetic pulse if the weapon discharges higher in the atmosphere, and NATO countries are affected. NATO, I think, has to respond. And then that is a muscular response we haven't been talking about. Forget about the fly zone. So I think the nuke thing, at least for the moment, well, remember, I was wrong about war in Ukraine, so I don't want to be wrong here, is off the table. But I do think that finding strategies to win, and I think Putin's on his back foot, isn't he? I mean, if his military is substantially degraded, if a huge number of his soldiers who weren't well trained anyway in Ukraine are dead or wounded, if he's now trying to hire mercenaries from Syria and, a ragtag group from, somewhere to try to carry this out, and all his atrocities are live on TV, this doesn't look good to me for him.
Yeah, let me amplify that because, I can't resist looking at this as a politician. And I've worked in Eastern Europe and some former Soviet areas. Even dictators have constituencies. And there's, the kind of conventional wisdom is, Putin's got an iron grip. And I've seen kind of journalism where reporters go wander into somewhere and somebody tells them Putin great because they've been watching state TV. But they have VPNs, particularly in the cosmopolitan cities. And we learned during the Radio Liberty, Radio Free America days that they're smart and they know a lot. So I don't think, being contrarian, I buy this idea that the Russian people have no idea what's going on and they're rooting along. And I also think if you look at the power structure in Russia, if you're an oligarch or a big economic leader, this is awful. This is bad for business. If you're a general, it's never been worse to be a Russian general. They're going to be show trials afterward. You've got FSB people under house arrest. You can't get to the money you stole on equipment contracts you've got stashed in Switzerland anymore. And so you start kind of going down the list, even if you're a Russian geopolitical thinker. My God, the Germans are rearming, NATO's united, defeat after defeat after defeat, humiliation. Is his position that secure? You know, the experts say it is, but I have to admit the experts are often wrong. We've been I thought the crack Russian army was going to be in there in 30 hours. So let me just ask some real experts. Am I crazy? Or if the oil weapon, if the Europeans do start to curb oil income and we go from the GDP of Italy to the GDP of Belgium, does Putin survive internally? Is he got the firm grip? Colonel, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think that I've described this as the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. The expectation was, and I wrote an article about it, I think in June or so before the summit, that we need to cast off our wishful thinking about what we could do with this regime and stop calling for resets and things of that nature. On the expectations that we would have to have a long-term engagement with the Russian people and think about what we could do after 2036, after 2 more terms of Putin, after his current term expires. And that's kind of just the mark on the wall. I mean, as long as he's in power, he would be the leader. But the expectation was that he would stay until 2036. That's a long time. That's another 14 years. And he's about to turn 70. He'd be 84 years old by the time he's done. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's actually a reasonable scenario in which he doesn't survive past 2024 without a significant win, without a significant reversal. And the reason is that, this contract that he had with the elites, with the security services, the security services that they'd gain primacy, they would hold the power. With the elites, that there would be prosperity, they just had to stay out of politics. With the population at large, that he'd return the country to greatness. All of that is out the window. So the question is, and he's the most powerful man in Russia, but he still sits atop a pyramid of elites in different constituencies, and those different constituencies can look to move in a different direction. I think they're very likely to move into a different direction. And the reason is, right now he actually enjoys a significant amount of support, propaganda, decade of propaganda or more. And this fact that Russia's beleaguered and attacked by the West, and this Russophobia and all these kind of things has mobilized the population, but they haven't actually started to bear the cost in a significant way. There have been some small scale political protests, but the vast socioeconomic protests have not unfolded yet because sanctions haven't started to bite. That's going to be weeks more, maybe a couple months, but those are going to start to bite. There's going to be pressure on, providing basic provisions for family, let alone all the creature comforts for the middle class. The security services, it's not just the paychecks that they're promised. They're promised kind of all the other rents, all the other kind of bennies that are going to start to fall off. That plus the military losses are going to start to have a increasing pressure on him. And it's just hard to imagine that he's going to be able to, as good as he's been at managing all these elites and at orchestrating kind of like, pitting one set of elites against another, that he's going to be able to be successful. So that's a more amorphous, I don't necessarily see that he's going to get assassinated within weeks. He's got a good grasp on the tools of repression. I don't see any viable alternatives, but I just could see pretty clearly that this is the beginning of the end, and he's not likely to last, more than a couple more years. And somebody could ask me about that in 2 years and see if I'm wrong.
Well, Jane, you've been in politics, foreign policy. I can tell you, I spent a little time with Gorbachev after he left office, and he struck me it would have been a perfect old school mayor of Chicago. Politics is politics everywhere. Politicians. What do you think Putin's internal situation may be if failure compounds here?
Well, something we haven't mentioned was Russia's misguided invasion of Afghanistan. Remember that in the late 80s? Russia lost. Oh, by the way, Russia lost. We were helpful on the other side. Remember Charlie Wilson's war? We provided a lot of help to the Mujahideen, and through heart and bravery, things we're seeing in Ukraine, they defeated Russia. What happened after that? The Soviet Union fell apart. So there is a history of Russia losing things and then I don't want to use the words regime change, but then change in leadership. It is not clear, and Alexander Vindman just said this, that what comes after Putin would be better in case Putin goes away. But the other piece of free advice I would offer is we should, as TR used to say, Teddy Roosevelt, talk softly and carry a big stick. Demonizing Putin personally and calling him all kinds of names, whoever may be doing that out there, is not helpful because he can twist that using his own propaganda and say, see, they're after me. They're trying to force me out. And that's not helpful. The other comment I'd make is on the polling that we're hearing about in Russia. Apparently, the firm is pretty well respected. But as I understand it, they call people, however they call them, and some people refuse to answer. The people who answer are usually pro-Putin. I think they're terrified to say we're not. So these polling numbers may be very, very inaccurate.
No, I would bet on that. I know some Russian pollsters been over there. And they also have the administrative resource, which is code for, they call up the pollster and say, hey, 90% of government employees agree that it's right, and they should be 30% of your sample. Adjust your data or we're combined tonight. Okay, quickly, we're almost out of time. We're going to do a lightning round here, quick answers. Robert Lucero wants to know, wants you both to quickly address the argument people make that the NATO expansion over the last decade has kind of boxed Russia in and created a part of this problem where they feel threatened and have switched to the offense. That's clearly part of Putin's internal propaganda. Is NATO expansion to the Russian border been a tragic mistake? Colonel, you first, and then Congressman.
So not at all. I think the last time that a country approached Russia's borders was about 15 years ago. That doesn't explain why all of a sudden he's now taking action. This is all about Russian power, a Russian empire, Russia's self-conception of itself, the fact that it needs to subjugate Ukraine in order to start to reestablish itself as a kind of a pole in a multipolar world. None of the other, the NATO explanation does not explain the why now factor of this question, which is a critical component. It's mainly more about the fact that Ukraine was continuing to make strides. And if Putin didn't act now, it'd just get harder. He had a sense for that. He was right. He just didn't know how right he was. And then the fact that there was a perception around Western weakness, a Western lack of resolve, internal distraction in the U.S. Those types of things are much, much more explanatory than kind of a Mearsheimer type of NATO expansion that really doesn't. I think it's evident now. It should be evident now that this is about Russia, just following what Putin's words have been from the beginning of this war.
Well, I was in Congress. I supported NATO expansion. It was driven primarily by Madeleine Albright, who had this compelling story as a refugee from Czechoslovakia. It was opposed by George Kennan, the author of Containment. And so there was some real serious opposition. But I remember at the time feeling that it was a good idea. And Russia was offered a kind of second-tier position as an adjunct member over time. But a bigger point is this. When the Cold War ended, we had no strategy, we, the United States, for what our role should be in a post-Cold War world. This is the central thesis of this book I've written called Insanity Defense, Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. And I've discussed this book with the USC audience in the past. But what we missed was that everybody didn't want to be us. We were not the sole superpower. China viewed itself as a future peer competitor and didn't want to be us. Terrorists wanted to take us out. And the sense of Russian grievance being, forced to accept defeat and offer no olive branch the way we did to Japan and Germany after World War II, fed this sense of grievance, which is now playing out with Vladimir Putin as the orchestra conductor. So in spite of NATO expansion, I think we would still be at this point of a very angry Russia trying to bring geopolitics back.
Let me do a combo final question for both of you. We only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I know the Colonel has a hard out here. It's become apparent that Russia is no match for NATO. Given this fact, how much killing and human rights violations does it take to get NATO or the international community to act militarily to stop an unjust war? Second, when this ends, should Ukraine be admitted into NATO? So, Colonel, why don't you take a 1-minute stab at that, and then
Sure.
Jane, and we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Congresswoman. I think the fact is that the American public are going to probably force this issue even before the elites are necessarily ready for it. There's a lot of intellectual elites, political elites that kind of, ruminate on this issue and ruminate on risks. But I think the tolerance of the American public for barbarism is about expended. So I think we should be on the cusp of kind of an open faucet of support to Ukraine. If we don't see like material increases in support on the ground, it's going to be disaster in Ukraine in terms of more lives lost, but it's also going to have a significant blowback on this administration for being out of step with where the public wants to go. So I think, we're basically about there. I mean, the attacks on maternity hospitals, these, murders of civilian population have kind of run their course. Unfortunately, no surprises there. So I think that's where we're headed, and I hope that the administration, doesn't have its head in the clouds and misses the indicators and tries to delay on this much longer, because that's where we are.
I think that the issue of NATO is up to NATO, and it's up to Ukraine. And Ukraine has to want admission, which it does want, and NATO has to decide to admit it, which it has not decided to do. And just think about Ukraine at the moment being occupied by a foreign country in the Donbass, whether that remains or doesn't, and Crimea being hacked off by Russia illegally in violation of international law. So it's tricky for Ukraine to get into NATO, in addition to which Finland, Sweden, and Norway are not members of NATO, and yet they're very much sympathetic to what the West is doing. So I don't think there's an obvious answer to whether it should be in NATO. And I think the idea of strategic ambiguity, to use an overused U.S. diplomacy, is a good thing, at least with respect to that. I agree that we have to win. I mean, Ukraine has to win, and we have to help it win.
Well, thank you very much on behalf of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. We like long names here. And the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy. Colonel Vindman will be coming back to do the commencement address at the Price School, which Jane Harman did in 2011. So we only get the best. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank both of you for participating. I learned a lot, and buy their books. All righty. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next Bully Pulpit.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Facebook.